All right, guys. Today we're going to go over the judicial branch, our Unit 4 notes, going over mostly, focusing on what the powers of the Supreme Court are and the term and the definition of precedents and how the Supreme Court, when they rule on a case, they ultimately set the precedents of how all future similar cases are going to be ruled on. Okay, so first thing we want to start with is just the basic definition of what a law is. It's simply a set of rules and standards by which a society governs itself. I always like kind of starting with looking at some of the earliest forms of written law in human history. So going all the way back to nearly 4,000 years ago, the Code of Hammurabi in Babylon, which was really much like an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth type of law. If you murder someone, you will be killed. If you, I even read some of these. If you get caught cheating on your spouse, the cheater and the spouse that was cheating will be tied up and thrown in the river or something like that. So very kind of hardcore punishment type laws. Definitely many of them would be considered cruel and unusual punishment under our Eighth Amendment rights today. Then you got things like the Ten Commandments in the Hebrew Bible, as well as the 12 tables of Roman law in ancient Rome. So those are some of our earliest forms of written law that societies were going to be governed by. So ultimately, we got to go back to the Articles of Confederation, because under the Articles, there was no judicial branch. So there was no group that would interpret the laws and that were being written, that would interpret the powers of government as far as one group of government abusing their power. There was nowhere to go if the people wanted to, essentially sue the government because, the government's infringing on their rights. And we see that going on a lot right now, state by state. You see a lot of people kind of rising up with the COVID situation and saying, wait a minute, you can't tell me I can't do this or that. The government doesn't have the power to do that. So you see in some areas of the country, you have the people rising up and even suing their state governments. Eventually, some of those cases might make it to the Supreme Court, who will have to determine, do the states have the power to tell these people yes or no in these areas? All right, so the judicial branch was created for those reasons in Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution. All right, in the U.S. Constitution, only creates one court. The federal court created the U.S. Supreme Court. There are no other courts, federal courts created. So it gave Congress the power to create lower federal courts. So the court system we have today, ultimately Congress was given the power, to create more courts other than the U.S. Supreme Court. Now each state, that's separate. Okay, each state, I'll show you a little diagram here in a little bit. Each state has its own set of courts. So you go to downtown Joliet, you got the Will County Courthouse. Okay, that's part of our state and local court system. That's not part of the U.S. federal court system. It's a whole separate system. So with the checks and balances of our U.S. Constitution, you can see down here where it says judicial branch, their main check on the other two branches is one, when they want to check the president, the executive branch, is to determine and declare if presidential actions are constitutional or not. All right, so the judicial branch will keep an eye on the executive branch and say, okay, what is the president doing? What's the vice president doing? What are the people within his branch doing to make sure that they are not violating the Constitution in any way? And then when they check on the legislative branch, since the legislative branch is a lawmaking body, the court's job is going to be to declare whether or not laws are constitutional or not. So they're always interpreting and checking the powers of the other two by making sure that those two branches are following the Constitution. All right, so introduction to the judicial branch. So the U.S., what we have in the U.S. is kind of unlike any other system. Is we have a federal and a state system. So we have a dual court system. Right now, like it says there, the federal courts are going to deal with any time there's federal laws being broken. State courts are going to focus on when there's state courts laws being broken, and also deal with the civil cases. Remember, civil cases are going to be when one person sues another. That's going to be done at the state level. That's not going to be done at the federal court level. All right, so there's two types of cases. We've got our criminal and our civil. Criminal, we've talked about this before, would be your major crimes, okay? And then your civil cases are what I always identify as your Judge Judy type cases, where you have one person suing another person over damages they've caused or whatever reason they need something from them. So in the U.S. Constitution, all right, the Supreme Court has the power to review any cases at the federal level or the state level. That's what the U.S. Supreme Court is for. So you can see in this diagram, you kind of got the three levels. If we go on the right side first, you start down here at our state trial courts. This would be, like our Will County Courthouse down in downtown Joliet. If you don't like the outcome of your case there, you can appeal it to the appellate courts within the states. If you don't like that, you can go to Springfield and try to hear your case heard at the Illinois Supreme Court level. Okay, that's the state level down in Springfield. On the federal side, you also have courts, federal courts that are going to deal with federal laws being broken. So it'd be like tax type laws or something like that. If you don't like the outcome of your case here, now you can appeal it to the U.S. Appeals Court. And the same thing on both sides, the final court, the top court in the land is the U.S. Supreme Court. Right now, the U.S. Supreme Court has what we call original jurisdiction, which means they can hear a case for the first time. So if it's a case that's involving people's rights or something being violated, it may not go through all those levels of courts below it. It could go right to the Supreme Court. Or they have the ability to hear cases that have already been heard at lower level courts. Okay, so Supreme Court's unique in that way. It can take on cases of either level. All right, so the U.S. Supreme Court, when choosing a case, remember they're going to focus on cases that have to do with, laws being broken and whether or not laws are constitutional or actions are constitutional by different levels of government. So it's a little different than what you would see on, if you like those Criminal Mind or Law and Order type shows where you see them go to court and you have a trial, you have a verdict, and someone's found guilty or not guilty. That's not the case for the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's going to focus on whether or not someone's rights were violated or not, whether the Constitution was being violated or not. And that's how they're going to make their decisions. They're not going to offer guilty or not guilty verdicts. So what might happen is you might see in a situation where, someone who's found guilty of a murder appeals their case all over the U.S. Supreme Court. And if it gets to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court decides to hear it, now, yeah, they were found guilty of murder at the lower court, but they might, the Supreme Court might find that they were found guilty by using evidence that violated their constitutional rights. If that's the case, even though that person may have been guilty of the murder, technically, if they were found guilty under, an invasion of privacy or a violation of their rights, that case, lower court case, could be thrown out, and so would the murder verdict as well. All right, so Supreme Court justices are determined by the president, okay? So we have 9 total justices on the Supreme Court. So when the president is elected to the U.S. To be the U.S. president, they get to choose who the next Supreme Court judges are, if there's open seats. There's only 9, so they don't become available very often, okay? And this is one of the things that I want you guys to understand is, and why, the Supreme Court, I always look at the judicial branch as kind of the forgotten branch. A lot of times we just forget about, well, we know the laws are made in the legislative branch. We know the president is the most powerful person in the U.S. and is in charge of the executive branch. And then we're kind of like, who cares about that judicial branch? Well, it's a very important branch because they're going to ultimately determine if what the other 2 groups are doing are following the Constitution or not. So when we vote for a president, you're essentially voting for Supreme Court judges. All right, if you're going to vote if you elect a liberal judge or a liberal president, most likely they're going to appoint liberal judges. All right, they're going to make their decisions on cases in a more liberal way. If you elect a conservative president, more likely that they're going to choose judges for the Supreme Court that are more conservative. All right, so you can see this cartoon here. It's a picture of the Supreme Court and the steps. It's up on wheels with 2 cranes with the left and the right. So it's referring to, the right being the Republicans and the conservatives, the left being the Democrats and the liberals. And it says after this presidential election, we'll start moving to our new location. So every so many years, as Supreme Court judges leave this position or they die while they're a Supreme Court judge, and there becomes a vacancy, whoever's the president at that time gets to pick. So as we swing back and forth between Republican and Democrat presidents, we also kind of swing our Supreme Court between liberal and more liberal and more conservative. All right, so there are no qualifications to be a U.S. Supreme Court judge, which is kind of crazy to think about. You don't have to be a U.S. citizen. You don't have to, be living in the U.S. for a certain amount of years like some of our other positions. You just have to be appointed by the president, and then the big thing is you have to be approved by the Senate. All right, so that's pretty hard to do. Okay, it's like you're on trial. You're put up on in front of the Senate committee, and they're going to look at everything about your background. All right, one of the more recent judges that were put up for up by President Trump, they looked all the way back to things he wrote in people's yearbooks in high school. All right, so I kind of laugh at the fact of what's going to happen when your generation of adults eventually are becoming Supreme Court judge nominees, and they're looking at what you guys have posted on Twitter, on Instagram, or all these different social media sites, and they're going to dig and dig and dig if the opposing party doesn't like the nomination. So, but if you are appointed by the president and the Senate approves you, you are there for life. All right, it's up to you. If you want to retire, you can. If you want to step away for whatever reasons, there have been Supreme Court judges that have died while on the panel, because what happens is if you were a more conservative judge, all right, you were appointed by a Republican conservative president, you don't want to leave the position until there's a conservative Republican president in office to replace you with. So a lot of times these judges, as they get older, they might try to hold out till after another election or two to make sure that if they retire, there's a president in place that's going to replace you with someone similar. Okay, what you might see with someone like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's well into her 80s. She's had some health issues recently, but she was appointed by, I want to say, Bill Clinton, more of a liberal Democrat. And so she doesn't want to retire right now because we have a more conservative and a Republican in the presidency. So you might see her, she's trying to maybe hold out until the next election to see what happens, then go from there. All right, let me go back real quick. That life term is there for a reason. It's to try to, like I have a point there, to keep justices free from political pressure. The goal is that if they're not there and have to get reelected, that they're not going to be swayed by Republican or Democrat parties. Now they're going to have their views. They're going to be more liberal or conservative. That's natural. That's just being a human. But when it comes to like a reelection campaign, if certain people are lining your pockets to help pay for your campaign, you're going to do things or rule in a certain way, and that's what we wanted to avoid, and that's what the writers of the Constitution wanted to avoid. So they made it a life term. All right, so there are 9 justices, 8 associate justices, and 1 chief justice. All right, just a little background on how much they get paid. It's decent earning, over 200 grand each. All right, so there's 9. No one has more power than the other, even though there's a chief justice. At the end of the day, they have the same power as an associate justice. The only reason that they're called the chief and they get paid a little more is they're going to kind of set the orders of this is what we're going to be doing today, this is what we're going to be doing tomorrow, kind of the schedule of the Supreme Court. But when they rule, they all have the same amount of power when they rule on a case. So a couple things about the firsts. Okay, our first African-American justice was appointed in 1967, Thurgood Marshall. First female justice wasn't all the way until 1981 with Sandra Day O'Connor. All right, so when a president is choosing a Supreme Court judge, these are some of the things they're going to be thinking about. All right, judicial philosophy. Now, remember, they're supposed to be kind of a Supreme Court judge needs to be, not right or left, Republican or Democrat. But at the end of the day, like I say, they're humans, so they're going to be more to the left or more to the right on different opinions. When you think of something like, an issue like abortion or, marriage laws and stuff like that, you're probably just human nature. You're going to be more to one side or the other. Okay. So the president who has an opportunity to fill a Supreme Court spot will be looking at your judicial philosophy. So, what's your political ideology? What are your beliefs politically? The race, gender, religion, region, where they're from. It's going to be important. All right. Because, you don't want to pick one person over another just because of race, gender, or religion or where they're from. But at the same time, as a president at this point in our country's history, you want to keep that Supreme Court panel diverse. All right, you don't want to, go back to our early 1900s and have all white men on the Supreme Court again. But at the same time, you obviously want the most qualified people. So trying to keep the most qualified and also separate between race, gender, religion, and region of the, picking someone from the South versus the North or the West Coast, East Coast. That's something you want to be mindful of. You don't want all the Supreme Court judges being from, the state of New York, all right, because they might only be thinking of, New York City urban, ideas and issues, right? They'll be only focused on that type of lifestyle. You want it a more diverse panel so that all ideas are being heard when those cases are being decided on. Judicial experience, all right? Have they been an attorney before, a judge before? Now remember, the Supreme Court judges are not dealing with guilt or not guilty verdicts. They're not dealing with criminal law crimes. They're dealing with specifically the Constitution. Was the Constitution violated by a government or by, you know, a group of people in society? Litmus test is just looking, okay, what is their view on maybe one single issue? You know, abortion's kind of always a go-to one, but what would they rule on abortion? Okay, and that could be the litmus test of a president deciding who the Supreme Court judge nominee is going to be for them. Acceptability, if this person is put up in front of the Senate, will they be confirmed? Would they be voted on yes by the Senate? So you got to think of that too. If you know that you have a person that you think is very qualified to be a Supreme Court judge, they hit all the boxes, right? To keep they have the judicial philosophy as you as the president. They'll keep the Supreme Court diverse by applying or appointing this person. But then you get to the acceptability and find out, the Senate would never pick this person. You might not be able to go along with it because you need that confirmation. So here's all our current Supreme Court justices. And you can see their ages as well as the president that appointed them. And then the number next to that is, what was their Senate vote? So you can see somewhere very close, like the first one, Clarence Thomas was appointed by George H.W. Bush, and he won 52-48. So it was a close voting margin. Or someone like Ruth Bader Ginsburg just, almost had 100% of the vote. Okay, so depends on the year, depends on the candidate, depends on the president. Sometimes it's a very close vote. Sometimes it's a, sure thing. All right, so the U.S. Supreme Court will get about 10,000 cases sent to them a year. They only have time to hear about 75 to 80. So there's over 10,000 cases of people's rights being violated, or a level of government, the federal government, violating its constitutional powers, and only 75 to 80 are going to be heard a year. So what happens is it's pretty quick to some extent. The attorney for each side will get 30 minutes to present their arguments. So you don't have much time, so you have to have your arguments set pretty good. And then the 9 justices have as much time as they want to ask as many questions as they want. And that could take days, weeks, probably months if it needs to, okay? And then once the judges have heard what they want to hear, they're done asking questions, they decide, are they going to rule in favor or against the case in front of them? And it's just simply majority wins. So that's why we have 9 judges. You want that odd number so that you always have a majority on the Supreme Court. So once let's go to judicial review first. So the most important power, and this is ultimately what I was just identifying, is the Supreme Court deciding if constitutional rights have been violated or not, is called judicial review. So it's the power of the Supreme Court. All right. So when you think of judicial review, think power of the Supreme Court, and this is them deciding whether or not things have violated the Constitution, whether the government or laws have violated the Constitution. Now it's unique because the term judicial review is not specifically mentioned in the Constitution. It was actually given to them by a Supreme Court case called Marbury versus Madison. I'm going to go into more detail on that in a future video set of notes. Okay, so just kind of put these 3 things together. Judicial review equals the power of the Supreme Court, and Marbury versus Madison is a Supreme Court case that identified that power of the Supreme Court. Okay, if you can kind of put those 3 things together, judicial review, power of the Supreme Court, Marbury versus Madison, you'll be good for right now. And obviously, the Supreme Court hears all its cases in Washington, D.C. All right, so when they vote on a case, all right, and there's the majority group, so 7-2, 8-1, 9-0, whatever it is, the majority opinion is the opinion that's going to go forward. So the judges who vote in the majority will get together, and it's unique because in a trial that we're used to seeing on like our TV shows and stuff, it's guilty or not guilty, done, and then a sentencing or punishment's put out, right? In the Supreme Court, they decide majority rule, and then they actually write out their reasoning for ruling the way they did, okay? And that's the reason for this is the majority is going to set the precedence, okay? What precedence is it's ultimately going to set the standard for how all future cases similar to it are going to be, all right? So like Roe v. Wade, set the rules for abortion. It said, yes, a woman has the right to choose, all right? So Now, going forward with abortion cases, that's the standard that the Supreme Court set back in the 1970s, saying the woman has the right to choose whether or not she wants to have an abortion. Now, the question today, and I know a lot of, when we've been in class the last couple semesters, this topic's come up a lot, is, how late into a term can a woman have an abortion? That's the question now that's being asked. All right, the law still is that the woman has the right to choose, but state by state is ultimately deciding differently, how late into a pregnancy can a woman have the abortion. So that's probably the case that will go to the Supreme Court next, okay? They're not going back on not allowing a woman to choose, but up to what point? All right, so that's why this word precedence is so key, is the case from the Supreme Court sets the precedence that all lower level courts have to follow, including the state courts. So the last slide here, does the decisions made in the Supreme Court influence your life as a high school student? Absolutely. You guys are going to look at about 5 or 6 Supreme Court cases that have impacted high schools and what high schools can do, covering things like free speech in school, privacy rights at school, school discipline. So to what extent can a school discipline you? You might be surprised when I go over this one later with you guys. There's still, I think, 8 to 10 states or something that allow corporal punishment. We're talking about like physical abuse as a form of punishment in schools. And, it's something like acceptable student club. So if there's a club for, this group, there's got to be a club for that group. So, is that a violation of students' rights or not? Okay. So that's the main points on the U.S. Supreme Court and the judicial branch. Make sure you guys go through this and take any notes. And these will be all things that will be fair game and help you on the Unit 4 assessment.